Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. Today will be the continuation of Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be part 11, chapter 11. Izuku feels so incredibly stupid as he flees the training gym, making a beeline for the locker room. He wipes furiously at embarrassed tears on his cheeks, sniffling as he tears apart his locker in an attempt to find his school uniform, which is futile considering his hands are shaking and he can hardly even think straight. It had taken him 3 tries to get his combination lock unlocked, and he'd yelled at the ghost. Out loud. People could hear him. His peers could hear him. His sensei could hear him. He'd yelled at his ghost in front of everyone he knew. How much had they heard? Had they listened to the whole one-sided conversation? Picked up bits and pieces? Just the end where he'd been yelling? What had he even yelled? Sensei had sounded so pissed, and as the snap of Izuku's name had cut through the arguing. Had he said something bad? Revealed something? He'd been lost in the moment and the emotions, hardly aware of what he'd been saying. Even now he could hardly keep his thoughts in line. They'd seen him talking, yelling, at nothing, at a ghost who existed only to him. How was he supposed to come back from this? How was he supposed to show his face in class ever again? At this point there's a small, nagging voice of anxiety in the back of his mind, telling him to just drop out of school, which is beyond insane. He won't. No matter how embarrassed he is, he'd worked far too hard to get here, and he wasn't going to willingly drop out at all because he'd done something stupid. He tries to push the thought from his head, but it's persistent. Sure, he was no stranger to embarrassing himself, but this was a lot. His whole class had seen him talking to nothing, having a full-on conversation with thin air. His teacher had physically yelled at him for raising his voice, and only then had he realized that he and Obero weren't alone. God, he'd really messed this up, hadn't he? He'd gone so long without being the weird kid who talks to himself. It's not the first time that he'd gotten carried away with a ghost, but it's probably his biggest mess-up yet. Seriously, everyone? In front of his whole class and his homeroom sensei. They're definitely going to talk about him, and if he knows anything about his classmates, kids in general, he knows the rumors are going to spread. It had been refreshing. He didn't have a target on his back or cruel nicknames that his peers would call him in hopes of getting a reaction from him. He'd just been normal for the first in his life, and he'd gone and messed it all up again by talking to a ghost, by fighting with a ghost. God, what had his life come to? Izuku shakes his head in an attempt to neutralize the thoughts, finally pulling out his uniform and changing quickly. There's a good hour until school is finished, and Izuku wonders what Sensei is going to do to him tomorrow for leaving class early without permission. The thought makes him shiver. He grabs his school bag and flees before anyone can come for him, deciding that whatever punishment he'll get is far better than staying here right now. He can't. He can't do it. Not right now, not yet. He is afraid that Sensei will come looking for him, or worse, a classmate. Maybe even Obero, and he's not sure he can handle seeing the ghost right now. Izuku is slowly starting to feel guilt creeping in, along with the anxiety. Obero hadn't deserved that. Any of it. He'd just been angry and tired. Afraid. He'd let everything build up, bottled it all up, and shouldered it alone because he was alone. And in the end it had all come out in a moment of weakness, that final straw that caused it all to come spewing out. It wasn't Obero's fault. Not in the slightest, and Izuku feels bad that he'd been the unsuspecting recipient of a week's worth, no, a month's worth, because this certainly hadn't just started, even if that's where it started getting bad, of Izuku's shit. The guilt tugs at his heart, and he hopes that the ghost will still want to be his friend even after everything. He can't lose another friend, not Obero. It was just a case of wrong place, wrong time. When it came to Obero, he'd just been the one to balance that last piece of straw, the piece that broke the camel's back. It hadn't been intentional, purely bad timing. It just had all been steadily piling up. His mother leaving him without a word was just a stupid note that Izuku definitely could have lived without. He hates it, but he still can't help but tuck it away safely in one of his analysis notebooks. Homelessness. His after-school job, the pressure of needing to work to survive. He had to work. He needed money. This had never been a problem for him. His mother had always taken good care of him. It's hard. His classes, not to mention his extra training with Sensei, too. Counseling. One for all and everything that came along with that. His own quirk, the ghosts, his doubts about Obero and their friendship that had all come out in a rush of emotions. The look on the ghost's face would haunt his dreams. He'd been trying not to hurt him, but he had. He didn't have a second to himself anymore. He didn't have any time to do his homework, and he knew his last few assignments haven't been up to par with everything that he'd done prior to his life falling apart around him. He's sure his grades are slipping, but then again, it's not like he's got a parent to be angry at him for it, right? Izuku drags a fist down his cheek as he steps slowly and quietly through the halls. Every little thing added a new weight, big or small, but weight on his shoulder nonetheless. It felt like he could hardly stand. It was too much. He was going to topple over under it. He had toppled over just now in class, surrounded by his classmates and his sensei. They'd seen him break, and he just ran away. Because that's what he does, apparently. Runs from his problems. He knew he was falling apart. He knew he wasn't handling this well, that he was barely even surviving despite the fact that he could keep himself fed. Sensei had been right. He was working himself to the ground. Between it all, he'd spread himself too thin somewhere, and now it was starting to crack. No, those cracks were there already. They were starting to split into gaping holes that Izuku couldn't mend on his own. He drags a rough fist under his eye, blowing out a sigh. The day had not gone well. This was probably one of the worst days of his life. His morning classes had been all right. No better, no worse, but than they'd had been the rest of the week. He tried to keep focus and listen, but he was just so tired. He hadn't had an actual good night's sleep since he'd found out about the eviction notice and fled the apartment without a word to their landlord. The past 2 nights, he'd been sleeping out on the street behind a dumpster because there wasn't anywhere else to be. The laundromat manager, a young man not too much older than 20, had shooed him away the second night that he tried to sleep there again. He'd been kind and awkward about it, telling him that he couldn't allow him to sleep there inside even if he was washing a pair of socks. Izuku had swallowed, nodding his head. He'd left the socks there as he walked out, stepping onto the dark streets. It was honestly terrifying being on the streets so late. He'd always had a curfew, even if his mother was never around to press it. Izuku had always stuck to it. Izuku jumped at anything that moved. He tucked into himself, keeping a tight grip on his backpack, knuckles tightening to a pale white with each step. He'd been scared. He knew there were places he could go, homeless shelters. That was always an option, but that would have made it feel real. Having to go to a shelter because he was homeless, and he was, but he still didn't want to believe it. He'd stumbled upon the isolated alleyway by mistake. His feet had ached from walking around for hours, and he was so tired. He just wanted to sit down. He'd arrived at the mouth of it, planning to just shuffle in enough that he'd be out of the way. It had been so quiet, he couldn't help but push further in. It had seemed perfect. It hadn't smelled bad. It wasn't incredibly dirty, no more so than anything else. He was outside, after all. There was a perfect-sized gap for him to tuck himself into, one that hid him away, but he was sure no one would be able to spot him. Still, sleep was hard. Any noise startled him awake. He was afraid to shut his eyes, to be vulnerable in an unfamiliar place. And he was afraid that someone would find him. Afraid he'd fall asleep only to wake up and find his backpack gone. He was afraid. But he didn't have a lot of options. He knows the lack of sleep had been hitting him hard. He could see the worry on everyone's faces. He could see the bubbling questions, and just prayed that no one asked him about it. He didn't want to tell anyone. He didn't want to worry anyone. He wasn't going to be a burden on anyone else, not like he had been to his parents. It was hard keeping it all to himself, though. He'd almost cracked at the weekend training with Sensei. He'd been homeless for 2 nights at that point, had spent his first official night on the street, relying on a phone alarm to wake him up in time for the training session. He hadn't really been asleep, but his eyes were begging to be shut. He'd almost told him that morning, sprawled on the mat as he tried to draw in breaths. It was the safest that he'd felt all week, even if he'd just been laid out by his teacher's quick reflexes, because he knew that his teacher would protect him. And then Sensei had asked if he was all right, and his mouth had gone dry, and he wanted to tell him everything, but he hadn't. Instead, he promised he was fine, which resulted in training being cut short. And the sad part was, he wasn't upset about it. He was tired. He ached. He just wanted to sleep, like actually sleep, dead to the world kind of sleep, But he knew that he had to keep pushing if he wanted to be a hero, so he had. He'd pushed until Sensei cut him off. He was almost thankful that the teacher had. He'd left quickly after that, knowing that he had to get to the cafe if he wanted to be able to buy something to eat. Lunch rush wasn't at school on the weekends, and he hadn't eaten anything the day prior either. He knows he disappointed his sensei. He can see it in the man's eyes as he benches him Monday during the hero training. The look on Sensei's face had been sour and distastefully when he'd sat Izuku out of practice in front of his peers. That had been a hit to his pride, and then Obero had brought it up. The apartment. It was still a sore subject. It had only been 3 days since he'd left. He didn't know how the ghost knew. He didn't care in the moment to ask. He'd just been so upset, so frustrated. It was the beginning of the end, his tipping point. He hadn't even realized that he'd blown up until he was left in the ashes of his own mess, glare softening at the look on the ghost's face, only to be shocked out of his own little world by his sensei's stern call. Izuku winces now in delayed embarrassment type of way. It's that weird, almost secondhand embarrassment, which isn't exactly right because it is still his embarrassment, just all over again. The teen sucks in a breath as he moves slowly through the halls. He needs to get out of here. He needs to leave. He can't stay here right now, not after that. It's not hard sneaking out of Yuuei, as one might suspect from the world-renowned school. He hopes it's hard sneaking in, compared to sneaking out. With most teachers and students in class, he barely sees anyone in the hallways, and no one pays him any mind, busy in their own schoolwork. Those few students in the hall, whether getting drinks or going to the washroom, barely glance at him, and he's never been more thankful to be ordinary. The boy pushes out the door, blowing out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding in. He slips his hands into his pockets, slumping as he moves down the long sidewalk before passing out the Yuuei gates. He knows he's going to be early, but he hopes the kind woman who'd given him his job won't mind him starting early today. He doesn't even care if he gets paid for the extra work or not. He just needs something to occupy his time and take his mind off of everything. Obero hadn't meant to follow Izuku. He really hadn't. He just knows that he can't stay in Shota's class watching them spar, knowing Izuku was supposed to be there as well. He hates to see his friend like that. Hates even more to know that he'd aided in Izuku being gone. Had he been too harsh on the teen? Gotten too involved? Too worried? He never really thought about the fact that it's so easy for him to overstep. That line had blurred years ago. He was polite about where he went and what he did. He had boundaries. There were lines that shouldn't be crossed, whether you're alive or dead, but he still didn't have boundaries like living people do. Had he overstepped into Izuku's life? He doesn't even know. He'd always been like this, fiercely protective and close with his friends. You can ask Shota and Hazashi, who'd been on the receiving end of his affection. It's just who he was. But he knows that he'd overstepped on their feet sometimes, too. Shota, mostly, who Izuku reminded him very much of. That stern, stupid mindset of, it's me versus the world, which it totally doesn't have to be. Together, he and Hazashi had eased Shota of that. Not completely, but he was still, and always would be, a stubborn idiot. But he was a lot better than he had been when they'd cornered the shy, angry-faced transfer into being their friend. But how was he going to do that with Izuku? He was a ghost. He hardly even existed. He didn't have the backup in the form of Hazashi's charming grin and loud, friendly attitude. The ghost gives a huff, suffering sigh as his hands into his pockets, shoulders slumping tiredly. He'd left the training gym shortly after Izuku, but he didn't dare go after the teen. He gets the feeling he's not Izuku's favorite person right now. He thinks about finding Hazashi, sitting with him and just enjoying his friend's presence as he teaches, but then he catches sight of Izuku leaving the school and watches him from the window as he walks down the pathway. He's worried still. Of course he is. Izuku's his friend, no matter what Izuku thinks. No matter how royally he'd messed up, he honestly does consider Izuku to be one of his closest friends. He'll need to prove that at some point, but for now he just wants to make sure the younger teen is all right. He keeps his distance, doesn't get too close. It's hard because no one usually sees him. Distance doesn't matter as long as he doesn't step into anyone's personal space, but with Izuku, the teen can see him, so he can hear him. If Izuku turned to look back, he'd see Obero following him, and the ghost really doesn't want to get caught following after him right after their spat in the gym. He doesn't really want to fight with Izuku ever again like that. He's not sure the ghost's heart can take it. He follows silently, keeping out of sight, but Izuku doesn't even turn to look. To be fair, when he's not talking, Obero is silent. There's no ruffle of clothing or soft noises of breathing. His feet don't slap on the pavement because he's weightless after all. When he's not avidly trying to make noise, he makes no sound. So really, there's no reason for Izuku to look back. He's still cautious, though. Izuku walks silently towards the train station, then waits after purchasing his tickets to his usual stop, the one a couple of blocks from his apartment. The apartment. His old apartment. With that in mind, Obero doesn't bother getting on the train, too. That's a risk of being seen, and he doesn't necessarily need it, so instead he pops up at the other end of the line and waits there to see the familiar head of forest green hair getting off of the train. It's not a long train ride, 20 minutes, maybe 25. Yuuei is pretty secluded, and it's on the other side of town from Izuku's neighborhood, so it actually makes good time considering walking would have been upwards of an hour from Izuku's front door to Yuei's entrance. Izuku gets off, and for the first time since he'd seen the rush of red lift to his cheeks and the genuine fear in the teenager's eyes, Obero looks at his face. He looks a bit more awake, not as tired as before, but you can easily see the building exhaustion. He wants to wrap the teen in a blanket and make him sleep for 15 hours straight. Izuku's eyes are red, like he'd been crying, and he probably has. Obero's seen him cry before, but he'd be lying if he said it didn't stab right through his heart like a dagger. He'd made the teen cry. Not intentionally, but still. If Obero hadn't opened his mouth, then Izuku wouldn't have either, and they wouldn't be in this mess right now. Besides the red-rimmed eyes, slumping exhaustion, and almost permanent downward curl of his lips, the teen doesn't look too bad. He doesn't look great, but he doesn't look worse. Izuku doesn't linger, steps away steadily in that way that you can if you've walked it hundreds of times. He follows after him, watching as Izuku turns down a different road that he's unfamiliar with. He feels stupid for assuming that Izuku was going to his apartment because obviously he can't. The ghost bites his lip, keeping his distance, but staying close enough as to not lose sight of him. He turns suddenly into a door hidden on the side of the building. Obero edges closer, glancing in the window, where he sees Izuku greet some people. He stalls for a second, a nervous flush on his cheeks as he waves his hands like he's promising something to the old lady behind the counter. "No, no," Obero can imagine him saying, "I'm fine." But he's definitely not. And he's not fooling anyone if, by the way the woman's eyes narrow as she says something else to him, if anything's to go off of. It looks like Izuku laughs as he says something. Obero can't really see, shaking his head before shooting her a sheepish smile that has the woman shaking her head and gesturing to the door off to the side of the room. Izuku bows his head gratefully before ducking into the door, only to return a second later with an apron tied around his waist. His bag and Yuuei blazer and jacket had been stripped off, as well as the tie, leaving him in just a white button-up and his school slacks. It takes a second longer than Obero would ever admit to realize that this must be Izuku's job, the job that had taken up so much of the teen's time, but now he understands why. Izuku was trying to survive any way he could. He was trying to keep his head above water while everything in his life was tugged away at his feet. There's a smile on the boy's face as he makes a beeline for one of the little tables where 2 people are sitting together, waiting to be served, but it's so fake that it looks almost wrong on his face. It doesn't match his eyes. Obero stays for a while. He's not really sure how long, just peeking in the cafe. Izuku doesn't notice him, never even glances toward the window between his work and talking to customers and the rest of the staff. Obero leans against the wall beside the window, turned just perfectly so he can watch what's going on inside the small cafe. The bustling of coffees and warm drinks being served, Izuku milling around behind the counter with the machines, talking to customers, cleaning, and waiting on tables. Before long, the boy disappears into the back of the room and comes out dressed in his uniform once more. His yellowy black pack is grasped in his hand, and he makes his way to where the woman is wiping a table. She hands the boy something, money maybe, and he bows his head thankfully in return. Obero ducks out of the window as the boy turns to leave, and pushes himself into the wall completely when Izuku steps out of the small cafe. Obero watches Izuku stuff the money into his pocket as he steps onto the street. It's later now, the sun's starting to set, and a chilly breeze sweeps over them. Following the money, his hands shove into his pockets as well, and he starts to walk, shoulders slumping as if someone had flipped a switch and drained all of Izuku's energy. It makes him sad to see. This kid was only 15 years old, and he was already so good at forcing himself to be okay until he had the time to break apart. It comes with being a hero. Obero knows this, but Izuku isn't a hero yet, and this is a learned trait. He'd learned this, and it had nothing to do with being a hero. Izuku walks for a while, steps slow and sluggish. He slipped his backpack on, but clutched at the straps like he was afraid that someone would swipe it from him if he didn't. The kid turns to a darkened alleyway. He glances around before pushing back towards the end, a dead end with a dumpster pushed up against the wall. Obero watches as the kid unzips his bag, pulling out a sweatshirt. He pulls it on with a relieved breath before finally wedging himself in between the wall and a dumpster, making sure his backpack is hidden and blocked in for protection. Obero's mouth feels dry as he watches from afar. Izuku was staying here. This was where Izuku was living. The kid was living behind a dumpster. The kid was living behind a dumpster and no one knew. Obero can't let this happen. He can't just leave Izuku to live by a dumpster. It wasn't safe. He wasn't safe. He'd have to do something about this. Shota had seen a lot of things on his patrols. Logical things, illogical things, weird things, odd things, normal things, regular things. He'd seen things that don't make sense and things that made perfect sense, but he's never seen this. The streetlight before him was flickering. Now, that in itself wasn't weird. Streetlights flickered, that happens, and there's many causes for a flickering streetlight. Power surges, dry bulbs, outages, the list goes on. There are many answers to a streetlight flickering. What wasn't normal, however, was the light flickering until he drew near, before shutting off completely. Shutting off only when he was underneath the light source. He'll admit he played around with it a little, tested it. This was something you needed to see to believe, and even seeing it now, he doesn't believe it entirely. It's not logical. He lives his life on logic, and this isn't it. But it happens anyway. So he's obviously going to investigate the phenomenon. The light would be bright, had almost blinded him from where he'd been perched on the edge of a rooftop, shining, no sign of shutting it off at all, and when he'd glance at it, scoping out where he was heading next, it would start flickering. Like clockwork, it kept repeating. He'd look away and it would be bright, and then he'd look back and it would flicker. Away, bright, back, flickers. It was like the light was trying to draw him in. It wanted his attention, and it was insanely illogical. An inanimate street light trying to draw in his attention? He felt like an idiot even thinking about it. Still, it was not normal. So he'd stepped up to see what was up with it. Streetlights didn't do that. Not normally. To his surprise, he'd stepped up to inspect it. The light went out completely. There was no warning. It was just going to go off. No flicker as he tried to conserve energy. It didn't look like it was trying to turn back on. It just went out, like something had blown into its wiring. There had been no noise, no sound of sparks that usually entailed something electrical malfunctioning. Besides the obvious fact it was out, it didn't look like it should be out. Again, no reasons why this could happen. Nothing happened without a reason. Maybe a wire gotten loose. The bulb died. Maybe a breaker was down somewhere, and, well, maybe that's not just one. It appeared that only this specific light was off. The hero leaned back to look around the light, inspecting for any damage or loose wires, but he could see nothing. But then again, he was in the dark because the light was off. He had good eyes, but he wasn't a raccoon or a cat with something. He didn't have night vision, therefore, without the light overhead, he really couldn't be certain it wasn't malfunctioning for a reason. The man shook his head before he glared up at the blacked-out bulb. He just had to assume that it had gone out. That was the most logical reason. He was stood in the dark after a flickering bulb had drawn him in. A dead bulb wasn't something to be overly worried about, though. They went out all the time. Half of the street lights on his patrol were out because they were in places the general population tended to not go. A dead bulb wasn't out of the ordinary for an underground hero to see. Lights being on were honestly more surprising. The man scoffed to himself, shaking his head. The absurdity. Shota turned away from the streetlight. capture weapon lifting off his shoulders to coil around a fire escape close by so he could pull himself up, except the light was back on. The surprise of suddenly being in the light made him jump, and when he spun back around with gritted teeth, the light went back out. His capture weapon dropped back over his shoulders in his confusion, gaze sweeping over the area to try and spot something, anything that could be messing around with him. He didn't see any electrical boxes, nor did he see a soul out here with him. So the light wasn't dead after all. There was something very, very weird about this. In nothing more than an attempt to test it, if he was actually losing his mind, Shota turned away a second time, and, as expected, the light was back on. He lingered for a second, hand gripping his scarf, to see it was just randomly flickering, and he'd just had some insanely impeccable timing, but the light didn't flicker or waver or go out again, until he turned to face the light again. He blinked slowly, trying to understand. It was weird. It wasn't normal. Lights don't do this, and certainly not to him. Sure, there are lights back at the apartment. Flicker sometimes. They'll go out and turn back on, but never like this. Honestly, Shota chalked it up to faulty wiring or their building having old power surges, and he won't deny that it's not funny when Hisashi turns on a light, only for it to turn back off just as he sits down again, or vice versa. Hisashi swears up and down their apartment is haunted, but the idea of ghosts is illogical. It's just something that always happened to them, way back when they first moved in together, and throughout the years. Once, maybe twice a week, something would do something weird, odd, but nothing to be concerned about. But it's never been like this, never as precise as this, and never anything as worthwhile as a full street light. The best he'd seen was their kitchen light flickering out before turning back on, and the lamp in the living room turning on and off. Shota's only seen that a couple times, however. Hisashi claims that it happens more often. Still, he can't come up with a logical excuse for why this light is doing this. Shota tucks his hands into his capture weapon as he stares up at the light. It's off still, but it had turned on just seconds earlier. The light definitely isn't dead if it's been turning on. The question is, why is it turning on, or better yet, why had it turned off to begin with? He glances to the left, noticing the streetlight off to the side shining brightly undisturbed, before glancing to the right where it's... Wait, is it flickering? The light overhead stays out, but the one to the right flickers, just as the one that he'd stood under had in order to draw in his attention. Surely this must be a hoax. With furrowed brows, the hero steps towards the flickering streetlight. The light that he was just under turns back on abruptly. He glances back but carries on towards the new light that flickers more intently as he gets closer. Like before, as soon as he passed in the new light, it shuts off abruptly. This is illogical. He's following streetlights like they're trying to lead him somewhere. What the hell? The light to the right of the new one he's under flickers again, repeating the process once more. Something really wants him to follow the lights. He's definitely being led somewhere. But by what? By who? Was this some sort of quirk? A trap? Was he walking into a villain's scheme right now? Even if he is, he can't in good conscience ignore the light sources leading him along in the dead of night, now can he? Even if it's not the greatest idea to follow along, play into whatever this is, he's intrigued. Deciding to throw caution to the wind in that way that Hisashi absolutely hates, the dark-haired hero shoves his hands into his pockets and starts walking in the direction of the flickering lights. The flickering has sped up now as he walks. They'll flicker once, maybe twice as he approaches, before shutting off completely and leaving him in the dark, as if someone's flipped a light switch as soon as he steps foot in the flow of said light. If he doesn't stop, neither does the lights, which turn back on as soon as he's past the actual bulb overhead, which is when the next starts flickering. It all moves fluidly. Each of his steps is accompanied by a light either flickering, shutting off, or turning back on. Something is tracking his distance, unsettlingly accurate with the light so it matches perfectly with him. Honestly, he's impressed by the dedication if this villain is trying to lead an unsuspecting hero into a trap. He follows the streetlights for a good half an hour. He's slower on foot than he would have been on a rooftop, but the lights are insistent, and he's unsure if they'll still work if he's not directly under them. They'd stayed on the main road up until this point. He'd followed the lights left and right depending, but they didn't stray from the main roads. The street light he stood under, turning on and off slowly, and the next one down the line doesn't flicker. He turns to look to the left, a sluggish one on and off overhead, then to the right, on and off again, before looking behind him. The light turns off. Behind him is an alley opening. It's dark, no street lights down the path. He's sure if there was any light sources it would have kept leading him. It feels like a trap. He's no longer on his patrol route, hasn't been for a good 20 minutes now. He's blindly following these lights that had appeared to be leading him along. He has half a mind to believe that he imagined the whole thing, but here he stands at the mouth of an unfamiliar back street. The light above him flickers lazily as if prompting him on, and a chill climbs up his spine as he looks back towards the alley opening when the light's gone off again. When he takes a step in, the light comes back on, and he glances back at it again, but it doesn't flicker. The beam is steady and uninterrupted. That had happened, right? Shaking his head as his hands into his capture weapon, in case this really is some sort of a trap, the man sneaks in. He is silent as he steps carefully in. He's not sure what he's expecting to find. He doesn't even know if he'll find anything. The alleyway is silent, that dead kind of night silent. His steps are the only thing that he hears, soft and steady. He tightens his fist, clenching his fingers around his scarf until his knuckles turn white. He's waiting for something to jump out at him, for something to attack or flee, but nothing comes. By the time he reaches the end of the alley, a dead end, the man feels like he really had been punked by his own brain. What the hell? Had that really happened? It was completely illogical, but it had been entirely real, he was sure of it. Shota surveys the dead end with a heavy frown, looking for something, anything out of place. Is there anything here that doesn't belong here? Anything worthy of the streetlights leading him here? Something moves in his peripherals, and he is quick to jump, scarf flying overhead, ready to neutralize any potential threat. It drops abruptly back to his shoulders when he notices sneakers. Red sneakers. Familiar red sneakers, but he can't quite put a finger on where he'd seen them before. It's not just the shoes. Attached to those red shoes are feet, and attached to those are legs. Shota's sure there's the rest of a human there too, but they're hidden, wedged in between the wall and the dumpster. He comes into contact with the homeless a lot. Life hasn't been kind to a lot of people. He knows some pros turn their head and pretend not to see it, but he likes to check in. And, well, when he finds people unconscious in alleyways, he likes to ensure that they're not dead. Shota moves towards the person, trying to make himself as loud as possible to announce his presence, without being overly loud to scare the shit out of them. He stomps his boots just a little louder than he normally would, but the person doesn't stir. Probably not good. "Hey," Shota calls, leaning towards him. The person's head is tucked into a hook, angled downward slightly. He can't see their face, but he catches sight of a bright yellow backpack pressed between the wall and the person's body. The figure is small and Shota freezes. A bright yellow backpack? Bright red sneakers? A wave of panic rushes through him as he grabs one of the person's shoes, giving it a light shake. "Hey," he calls again, more urgent this time. It's just now that Shota's eyes zero in on the familiar Yuuei uniform, slacks, as well as a rumpled-up white uniform shirt, peeking out from under the bright sweatshirt. Oh God, this really is his problem child. What the hell was Midoriya sleeping out on the street for? Feeling more confident that he knows this person, and also needing proof that this is his problem child, even if everything pointed towards yes, it was Midoriya Izuku sleeping in a dark, dirty alley, the man pushed the hood back up off of the teen's small head, sucking in a breath as he does so. Curls of dark green spring up under the hood, and with the hood gone, the man can make out the dusting of Midoriya's freckles, even in the awful night lighting. And there's no doubt that this is one of his kids. His problem child. All Shota can do is whisper out profanities under his breath as he scans for any injuries on his face. "Midoriya," he calls again, hoping that his name will stir him better than Hey had. The kid doesn't move, and for a second Shota's body goes rigid. Fear pulses down his spine as he leans forward, tapping the kid's cheek with urgency. "Midoriya, hey, up and at him, kid, come on." The last he'd seen the boy had been the afternoon when he'd rushed out of the gym without a word. He'd been fine, well, mostly fine, unharmed at least, Shota won't pretend to know why Izuku was so upset, and he hasn't the slightest clue at what he'd been yelling at. He'd come to know Izuku as a mumbler, a child who would mutter to himself, and so when he glanced over to see the kid's mouth moving, he didn't really think anything of it. But then he'd shouted, and Shota had been surprised. The angry yell from the green-haired teen had startled the class, drawing in curious eyes from all around, and the only thing he could think to do was snap the kid out of whatever he was doing by calling his name loudly. Midori had left right after, and as much as Shota wanted to chase after him, to get an explanation, he still had a class to teach and students to be responsible for. There comes a point when you're a teacher working with young people where you need to back off and let them go, even if he's a little annoyed that the problem child had just ran out without a word. He'd been fine when he'd left class, though. Tired and unfocused, but fine. Shota's taps on the teen's cheek get more persistent. Midoriya, I'm 5 seconds away from calling for an ambulance. Wake up, problem child. The kid stirs, thank the heavens, groggily curling himself tighter before unfurling and blinking slow, owlish eyes up at him. He reaches up to rub at his eyes with a white, probably frozen fist, before cocking his head as if trying to gauge the situation in his tired state. Sensei? His voice is curled with sleep, tired and drawled. He shivers, tucking into the sweatshirt. Shota sits back on his haunches, where he's still crouched beside the boy. His heart is still pounding anxiously in his chest, but with the kid conscious and speaking, he can let out a slow, anxious breath. His student, one of his kids, hadn't woken up right away. He's not sure if it's because of how exhausted the boy had been looking recently, or the cold night air, or something else entirely, but there's still warning bells going off in his head as he watches the kid sharply. It's just a second later that the kid jerks up abruptly, arms tightening around himself, as he gapes nervously at his teacher. It seems he's come to his senses finally. The sleep is wiped away and replaced with a familiar anxiety. Sensei? Midoriya. Shota replies blankly, frowning at the teen. He has questions, lots of them. But Midoriya has been out in the evening chill for who knows how long. He'd been asleep on the ground, his cheeks and nose an irritated red from the freezing breeze sweeping over them. His first course of action is getting him somewhere warm. Sensei, the boy winces at his own voice, pulling into himself like he's afraid that Shota might attack him. What are you doing here? I was on patrol, the man huffs, as he stands back up, looming over the child with a glare. What are you doing here? Alone in a dead-end alley at 2 a.m. The question is a trap, and Izuku sees right through it instantly. He's smart, Shota will give him that. Then again, the kid's asleep on the streets, so can he really give him that? Not a complete idiot, then. The kid bites his lip and drops his attention down to his feet. Midoriya's stiff fingers fiddle with his shoelaces, and Shota decides right then and there they're not going to get anywhere right now. The kid's obviously tired, and cold, and probably hungry. He wouldn't want to talk either if roles were reversed. Up, he demands, with a shake of his head. He gives the teen props for how fast he flies to his feet, clutching his backpack to his chest. Shota gestures the kid out from his hiding spot easily, and Midoriya scampers past him. The teenager pauses by Shota's side, waiting for direction. Where? He swallows, biting the inside of his cheek. Where are we going? Does it matter, kid? Shota asked tiredly, reaching up to tuck his hands in his capture weapon again. The wind nips at his fingers. It's freezing cold, and he can only imagine how cold the teen must be after who knows how long out here. Anywhere's better than here. Midoriya is silent, thoughtful at his side. Shota takes a couple steps before stopping, glancing back at the kid. He'd been around teenagers long enough to read the expression easily, so with a heavy sigh, the man explains. My place, Midoriya. I'll take you to my place for the night, because I sure as hell am not leaving you here, unless, of course, you have somewhere else to be, in which case I'll walk you there. He studies the teen, watches his body movements and facial expressions, how his fingers tense around the fabric of his backpack, how his lips curl downward before pressing into a straight line. He doesn't have anywhere else to go. It's all in his body movements. I don't... Midoriya curls. They block his eyes when he ducks his head. Nowhere else to go. At least the kid hadn't lied to him. The teacher nods, acknowledging his student's honest answer. Come on, then, Shota huffs out. hoping his voice comes out a bit more inviting than he thinks it does. Still, at this point, he knows his students are used to his hardened personality, or a lack thereof. You okay to walk? It's a bit of a trek from here. Shota looks around to try and gauge where they are exactly. He's not entirely familiar with this part of town, since he had strayed far from his patrol, but he's got a basic idea of where they are, and he's confident he can get them to the apartment. It just might be a little longer on foot. Yes, Sensei, Midoriya nods quickly. I'm fine. He's getting tired of hearing that from the kid. This obviously isn't fine, but he can tell that Midoriya that another time, and preferably after he's fed, warmed, and rested, then he'll ask questions and lecture some sense into him. They step out of the alley side by side, and Shota shoots a glance over his shoulder at the streetlights. They're all shining brightly, each and every one of them, that had flickered before shutting off. There's no trace of any residual flickering. The man furrows his brows as he tightens his grip on his capture weapon. Had that even happened at all? How the hell did he find Midoriya? He shakes himself from his thoughts, looking back at the child. Midoriya's hands are shoved in his pockets now, hood tugged back up. He's wearing his backpack, hunched over in exhaustion. The kid blows out slow breaths that fog up into cool night air. He gives a shiver that seems to vibrate his whole frame before curling in on himself even more. Shota hates to see his students like this. He hates to see any of them in the state that Midoriya is in, but there's just something so heartbreaking about his happy-go-lucky problem child so quiet and timid. Come on, problem child. Shota shakes his head, stepping towards the kid, so he can press his fingers between the kid's shoulder blades, just above the backpack in a guiding gesture. Shota's silently pleased that the kid doesn't flinch away from him. At least that trust is still here. Midoriya doesn't pull away from the touch, so neither does Shota. He just presses his hand closer to the kid, flattening it so his palm presses firmly, grounding him against the teenager. With his other hand, the man pulls up his cell phone out of one of his utility belt pouches, texting a one-handed message to his husband as a bit of a warning. He knows Hisashi won't care. He'd been just as worried about the green-haired teenager as he was. I'm bringing home a stray. He gets a single thumbs-up emoji in reply just seconds later. Content with the answer, Shota drops his phone back into the pouch before glancing over at the kid. They walk side by side, not slow by any means, but not as fast as Shota could have been there had he been on the rooftops. Still, Midoriya's tired, and he doesn't trust the kid enough to use his quirk. So he settles into the long walk. They don't talk, not really. Shota isn't one for pointless conversation, and Midoriya is worryingly quiet as well. It's different from the rambles and mutters that the boy usually has. He's not sure he likes it. They make it to the apartment, and Shota leads the teenager up the stairs and down the hallway, pulling his house key from one of the pouches to unlock the door. He hears Hisashi's footsteps before he sees the man. Shota has to shake his head when his husband rounds the corner of their apartment, tired smile jolting into a gape of surprise. Hisashi's eyebrows shoot up, jaw dropping as he freezes abruptly at the sight of the stray in question, a teenager, towing his shoes off, particularly hidden behind Shota. Shota doesn't think his husband knows who it is yet. That's not a cat. His charming, intelligent husband signs dumbly, wide eyes locked on the child. Midoriya's head is still ducked, his upper body hidden behind Shota. He's fiddling with his shoes. Shota doesn't even have to see it to know. Still, he'll gladly accept the second of distraction as he eyes his husband in silent warning. Shota shakes his head with a knowing look. It takes a second for Hisashi to manage to draw his shock back up to Shota, but when they catch a second of eye contact, Hisashi drops his gaze to Shota's hands for a signed reply of, I know. His husband shoots him a dirty look at the incredibly unhelpful reply, lip poking out in a pout. What did you do? Shota raises an eyebrow, blowing out in a light huff. I found him on the streets. Hisashi's shock bleeds into concern, eyebrows furrowing as he glances down at the child. At 2 a.m.? The dark-haired man gives a nod as Midoriya finally stands up again. He signs a quick, tell you later, to his husband before turning his attention back to the child. Midoriya's shoes are off, pushed politely against the wall in an orderly fashion. He doesn't move, but glances just a little around Shota to eye Hisashi. Shota kicks off his own boots, towing them against the wall haphazardly. Shota sees the exact moment that Hisashi figures out who he'd brought home. The surprise from earlier is nothing compared to the shock on his face now, as he stares at Midoriya's still weather-ripped cheeks and nose. Shota knows that his husband has a soft spot for the kid. He honestly doesn't know anyone who doesn't. "Come on, kid." Shota invites Midoriya in. As he speaks to Midoriya, he signs to Hisashi, just so they're on the same page without the kid hearing. "Guest room?" Hisashi stares at his hands for a second before seeming to finally decipher the signs and their meaning. He nods, turning on his heels to prepare the guest bedroom, and probably grab his hearing aids for Midoriya's sake. The kid hadn't seemed to catch on to the signing yet, but it was only a matter of time. Shota looks down at the boy that's inching along behind him. "Who was that, Sensei?" Shota raises an eyebrow, a smirk curling onto his lips. Ah, yes, without his obnoxious voice and that stupid cockatoo hairstyle, no one knew that Hisashi was Present Mic. Shota reins in the humored grin that he would normally have on his face, regarding the teen with a schooled look. "My husband?" Midoriya blinks once, then twice. It's probably a surprise. Shota wouldn't be shocked if his students thought he was single. It's not like he ever talked about himself around them. And he didn't wear his wedding band on his finger just because it was risky to announce something like that. Most heroes tended to keep their personal lives on the down low and never showed or spoke of loved ones. He and Hisashi were no different, especially at school or in their hero costumes where they're easily recognizable. Well, Hisashi is at least. Besides, he preferred they think he was single, less stupid questions that way. And he didn't want them prying into his personal life. He got enough of that from Namuri and the other teachers. They all knew he and Hisashi were married, yet still he never got a moment's peace. Oh, the teen exhales the word softly, head bowing in a thoughtful little nod. "Okay." Shota raises an eyebrow before shaking his head. "You must be cold and dirty. I don't want you catching anything from that alley earlier. Why don't you head up into the bathroom and take a shower to warm up?" Midoriya bites his bottom lip, looking conflicted. He clutches his backpack to his chest, but Shota doesn't say anything about it. He wonders how long the kid had been on the streets without him noticing. "Are you sure?" the boy asks slowly, almost nervously. "Yeah." Shota lulls his head in Midoriya's direction. "You don't have to, of course. I'm not going to force you, but we will be talking, either after you shower or right now." Izuku stiffens at that, glancing down the hallway. "Your call, problem child," the man muses. "We talk now, or you can have a couple of minutes in the shower to get your answers straight. Doesn't matter to me." "Shower?" the teen decides with a light frown. "Good choice." Shota nods, gesturing him down the hallway. Hisashi had disappeared down, before crossing his arms over his chest. "First door on your left down that hallway. Feel free to use whatever you want in there. We don't mind. Clean towels are under the sink. You got any clean clothes in there to change into?" Midoriya nods sharply, clutching tighter around the bag. Shota pretends not to notice it. "Good. I'll make us something to eat while you shower. Anything specific that you like?" "Oh, you don't have to." "Anything specific you'd like?" Shota repeats, cutting the kid off. He tries to keep his exasperated tone to himself. At this, the teen shakes his head meekly. "No allergies?" There's none on his school records, but then again, Midoriya also hadn't had a quirk before the school started, and that wasn't on his record. The kid shakes his head a second time, fidgeting with his own fingers. "All right," Shota huffs softly. "Off you go then. We'll talk while we eat. I have questions, and you should have answers." The kid looks nervous at that, but he nods anyway. He turns swiftly and disappears into the bathroom, the door clicking shut behind him. Shota lets out a sigh, running his fingers through his hair. He takes off his capture weapon, letting it pool on the coffee table for the cats to sniff. He hears the water turn on in the bathroom before making his way into the kitchen. "Mind telling me what the hell is going on?" Hisashi's voice almost startles him. When he looks back, his husband has his hearing aids in, and his hair has been brushed up into a messing bun. "Why is Midoriya here? Why was he out at 2 a.m.? Where did you find him?" "We're about to find out." Shota huffs, silently happy the chef of the apartment is going to be joining him. He'd hate to serve the kid something burnt. "Now, come help me make him something to eat. I don't think he's been eating well recently." A concerned frown tugs at Hisashi's lips, but he does as requested. settling beside Shota at the counter to help him make a very late dinner. A lot has happened in the last hour. He'd been caught sleeping on the ground, hidden away in a dead-end alley. He'd been caught being homeless by his homeroom teacher. Of course it was Aizawa-sensei who'd found him. Of course. His hands shake as he locks himself in his teacher's bathroom, eyes surveying curiously over everything in there. It feels weird to be in his sensei's home, his sensei's space. Izuku bites his lip as he sets his school bag down onto the counter, unzipping it to dig out a pair of sweats and a long-sleeve shirt. He hadn't grabbed any pajamas in his hasten to get out of the apartment after finding the eviction notice, and it's not like he'd change into pajamas on the streets anyways. He fishes out a pair of boxers, shaking his head as he reaches underneath the sink like his sensei had instructed, where he finds towels just as promised. With everything he laid out, Izuku turned to face the faucet, studying it for a second to understand how it works before finally turning it on. The water patters on the floor of the shower, but Izuku makes no move to undress. You know, he fiddles with the edge of his hoodie, pulling on a loose thread. It's weird that Sensei found me, even when I was completely hidden in a dark, isolated alley, isn't it? Yeah, weird, he hears someone clear their throat, proving his suspicion to be right. Izuku turns on socked feet, regarding the ghost with a frown. Obero looks nervous, shuffling his feet as he chews on the inside of his cheek. Actually, about that, I sort of followed you. I've gathered. Izuku shakes his head, giving the ghost an unamused look. There's no anger in it. He's over being angry, too tired for it. He continues on, voice bland and holding no heat. I told you not to. I know, Obero winces, squeezing his eyes shut like he'd committed to the ultimate betrayal. But I was worried about you. You just left class, and I know you were fighting with me, but I'm still worried because you're my friend, and I saw you go into the alley, and I knew that you were staying there, and I got this really gross feeling in my stomach, like someone walked through me, but worse, and I couldn't just leave you out there, Izuku. I couldn't. I'm sorry, but it's dangerous on the streets, especially at night, and I knew Shota would help you as soon as he knew, but I knew you also wouldn't tell him, and I'm sorry. We're not fighting anymore. Izuku shakes his head, pulling the sweater over his head before setting it on the closed toilet seat. I'm sorry, too. I don't think we ever were fighting. Just I was. That was unfair of me. You didn't deserve that. I mean, I'm not happy that you were snooping around or that you followed me even when I told you not to, but I get it. I would have done the same thing, too, for a friend. I'm sorry I yelled at you. Don't be sorry, the ghost yelps, rubbing the back of his neck. I totally did deserve it. Sometimes I forget I'm a ghost and that some of the stuff I do is overstepping. It's just stuff living people can't do. I really was just going to check on you, but then I saw your landlord and a moving crew in your apartment, and yeah, you did overstep, Izuku agrees softly, but with a tiny smile. He knows he can't hold it against the ghost. He probably doesn't even realize that he's doing it. Izuku gets that. It's a trial and error kind of thing, because no one else sees the ghost like he does. But I know that you didn't mean to. It's okay, mostly. Just try and remember living people restrictions every now and again, yeah? Trust me, Obero smiles, but it's not the wide one Izuku's used to seeing. I don't want a repeat of this. I'll be extremely hard to not ghost your business. There's a moment of silence, not quite uncomfortable, but not as much tension as when the ghost had first peeked in. I think, the ghost starts off slowly, maybe we should talk more sometime, preferably when your teacher isn't waiting on you. You're already in for a talk, eh? Don't remind me, Izuku pouts. I can't believe you... Wait, how did you lead Sensei to me? You're a ghost. Obero lets out a breathy laugh, looking tired as he rubs the back of his neck. Tell you later. So long as you actually tell me, Izuku teases, voice curled with humor instead of the frustration that he'd had back in the training gym at school. Obero seems to notice that too, because he's grinning, nodding his head vigorously. I trust you too, though. Izuku lets a small smile curl onto his lips at the way that Obero's face brightens with relief. Maybe he'd taken that fight a bit more to heart than Izuku had thought. He'd never really had a friend like this, not since before he'd gotten his medical diagnosis. It's nice. Getting back to the task at hand, Izuku strips off his socks. He glances down at the remainder of his clothes, biting his lips, and he glances back at the ghost. He hopes the running water is muffling the sound of his voice as he speaks with the ghost, but at this point he'd already embarrassed himself enough. What's one more embarrassing thing in front of his sensei? So, sensei's married, huh? Obero grins at that, nodding his head, because Izuku's already seen that. He'd gotten confirmation from sensei already. It's not a question. It's an observation framed like a question. I never even thought he was seeing anyone, let alone married. He's so secretive, hardly ever talks about himself, you know. Who's his husband anyways? He looked familiar, but I can't figure out why. Not to be cryptic, Obero cocks his head, tongue in his cheek as he smiled. But you'll definitely figure that one out on your own. Give it a couple minutes. Izuku puckers his lips in feigned annoyance before turning away from his friend. I feel bad wasting water while we're talking. I should probably, The teen gestures to the running shower. Obero gives a hum but clearly doesn't catch on. He doesn't make a move to leave, hadn't even seemed to connect the dots. Izuku snorts a laugh, angling his attention back to the ghost as he unbuttons his school shirt. I'm gonna get naked now, so unless you're that kind of ghost, get out. Right! Obero yelps, cheeks flushing brightly as he takes a couple steps backwards, right through the locked door, so just his head is peeking in once again. Oh, right, sorry, yikes, I'll be, enjoy your shower. Izuku laughs, throwing a wave over his shoulder as the ghost leaves him be. He strips the rest of his clothes, stepping under the warm stream of water that makes him shiver after being so cold for so long. It feels so nice. He hadn't had a chance to shower the past couple of days. He'd left without showering after training on Sunday, and he'd been in a hurry to leave after school that day. It was nice to get clean. He used a tiny amount from one of the shampoo bottles. It smelled fruity. Izuku can't help but wonder if it's his sensei's or the man's husband's. He feels bad using their soap, but a shower is pretty pointless without actually cleaning. Still, he makes quick work of the shower so he can get out fast. He dries off after shutting the water off, then dresses as quickly. It's weird to be undressed in his teacher's home. It's weird to be in his teacher's home, period. At least he technically has a friend here, because Obero follows Sensei around like a puppy. Izuku shoves his uniform and sweatshirt back into the backpack, hoping the uniform doesn't get too wrinkled before school tomorrow. School tomorrow was going to be weird. He'd been in his teacher's apartment. He unlocks the bathroom door after making sure that everything he touched was back in place. Even the wet towel was folded neatly on the counter. He would have hung it up, but he wasn't sure where to, since the towel rack was already full. He feels awkward. His steps are quiet as he pads through his teacher's apartment, bare feet announcing his arrival. His teacher and his husband are both at the counter, backs turned to him. He shuffles his feet anxiously, forcing a half smile when Obero, perched on the counter beside the men, gives him a wide grin and a sheepish wave. It's Sensei's husband who notices him first. Oh, the man chirps as he swirls around to grin at Midoriya. And wait a second. How was your shower, little listener? No trouble with the faucet? Present Mike? Izuku gapes, shooting a betrayed look to the laughing ghost. Well, that didn't take long. Aizawa huffs monotonously. You didn't tell him up front? Mike Sensei shoots Aizawa Sensei a scandalized look before he sent Izuku an apologetic glance. Where's the fun in telling him up front? He's smart. He would have figured it out eventually. All it took was you opening your mouth, Sashi. Shota, that's awful. Mike shakes his head. Sorry, Midoriya. I guess this is a bit of a surprise, huh? I thought Aizawa would have briefed you a bit before bringing you home, so you weren't thrown in head first. Guess I was wrong. Present Mike's tone towards the end is accusing, but Sensei just shrugs his shoulders indifferently, looking back down at whatever he was making. Izuku can just slowly nod his head, not trusting his voice in the slightest. He lets his gaze flicker to Obero, eyes narrowed in silent censure. That innocent question in passing of if his two senseis were close, flashing in his mind from a few weeks ago, and conveyed easily to the ghost who flashes a grin. Hey, I told you they were close, the ghost laughs, hands raising in surrender. I just didn't specify how close. To be fair, it wasn't really my place to share, but now you know. Your teachers are married. Weird, huh? He could have hit the ghost right now. Probably wouldn't even have felt bad about it. Midoriya? Present Mike's voice is soft and concerned. You all right? Not gonna disassociate on us, are you? I know this is a lot to take in so suddenly. Oh, no, I won't. I mean, I'm not, disassociating? Sorry. Izuku forces his attention back, smiling sheepishly when he catches both his teacher's gazes on him. Just surprised. I mean, we didn't think Sensei, well, that he never seemed fond of, you, I guess. I'm not. Aizawa Sensei snorts in agreement, which in turn prompts an offended scoff from present Mike. You are so, Mike sputters, spinning around with an accusatory finger at Aizawa Sensei, who stares back blankly, entirely unoffended. We're married. You are fond of me, and I know it. Don't lie to Midoriya, you grump. You definitely like me. Aizawa levels the man a glance, eyes flicking down to the finger almost pressed against his chest, before batting it away, looking towards his student. We made onigiri. I hope you're hungry, kid. Have a seat. Present Mike lets out a huff, shaking his head as he does so. He joins Aizawa Sensei at the counter again, but doesn't linger long, just grabs the tray of onigiri, while Aizawa Sensei collects plates from a cupboard. While they're distracted, Midoriya does as he's told, inching toward from the kitchen, settling himself down at the table. There are 4 chairs tucked in around it, so he pulls the one closest to the door out, sitting stiffly as he sets his backpack on the floor, tucked under him slightly. Coffee, Midoriya? Sensei asks after setting the plates down on the table. He turns back to the counter, already working on preparing a fresh pot of coffee. Izuku opens his mouth to reply, but present Mike beats him to it, sitting on the chair to Izuku's left. You are not giving our student coffee at 3 a.m. Some of us need to sleep. Then to Izuku, the man continues. We have tea or juice, water, anything suit your fancy, listener. Tea? Izuku shrugs, fiddling with his own fingers. He doesn't drink much coffee. He'd always been afraid of it shunting his growth like his mother had always told him, and he's already short enough as it is. He won't lie and say he hadn't been living off of the beverage over the past week and a bit from working at the cafe, but he still doesn't quite like the taste of it either. Fine, Sensei nods. Zashi? Tea, the blonde-haired man decides after a second. I'm still hoping to catch a bit of sleep before work tomorrow. I don't know how you can drown yourself in coffee and still be able to sleep. Aizawa Sensei doesn't respond to that, but he does move to fill the kettle. Aizawa Sensei leans the small of his back against the counter, scanning Izuku where he's sitting. The teen tries not to wriggle around nervously at the attention, ducking his head and towing his backpack on the floor, where it's leaned against the table leg. He's not afraid. He does trust his sensei, and he has a deep respect for present Mike as well. He likes him, but he can't say he trusts him quite as much as he trusts Aizawa Sensei, but still, he knows he's safe. He's just anxious. He doesn't want to burden them with his shit show of a life, but it doesn't look like he's really got any options here, especially with the persistent ghost hell-bent that he reaches out. Something brushes against Izuku's leg, and he jolts both out of his thoughts and up ramrod straight position. He may make a noise of surprise or something, because present Mike jumps in surprise too, and even Sensei's gaze jerks up, locking on the teen who's ducking under the table. That's Satan, Obero calls from the counter, cocking his head at the cat. The cat seems to stare right back at the ghost. He's mostly harmless, despite the name. Oh, Yamada-sensei laughs, head ducking down to look at the cat as well. Don't worry, listener, that's just Blanket. Blanket? Izuku frowns, glancing at first at the black and white tuxedo cat before narrowing his eyes at Obero. Yep, the blonde hair nods. Shota found him on the patrol a couple of years ago, when he was just a tiny little thing. He's appropriately named, though. Check any blankets before you sit down. It's a good thing cats have 9 lives, because he's definitely lost a few by being sat on. He's the sweetest, though. He's the devil, Aizawa-sensei scoffs from the counter. Obero gestures to Aizawa-sensei in a "that's what I said" kind of way. Despite his words, the dark-haired man taps once on his chest, and the cat rushes over, perching at his feet before jumping gracefully into his arms. He responds to both Blanket as well as his nickname Satan, which he's called by depending on how much of a little shit he's being. Don't be fooled by cute faces, Midoriya. They're menaces. There? The teen's eyes widen in surprise. It's hard to take the man's words seriously as he cradles the cat to his chest. He never imagined his stern, stony-faced teacher could look so domestic. But here he is with a husband, present Mike, cuddling a cat to his person. This night probably couldn't get any weirder. You didn't tell him anything, did you? Mike-sensei tuts, shooting Aizawa-sensei a light glare. We have 3 cats, listener. You'll probably see Fish and Nemo, too, at some point. Fish is pretty old. I've had him since I was around your age. And Nemo doesn't like anyone other than Sho. She's probably hiding somewhere. And there's a bunch of strays in the neighborhood that we feed too, but none of them trust us yet. I'm making progress with the strays. Wait a second. Was Aizawa-sensei pouting? Sure, Present Mike shrugs, angling his head towards Aizawa-sensei with a fond look. But we're already 1 cat over the pet limit in the lease that we signed. Like our landlord would notice. Well, she would if we have an entire army of cats following you around like they're cat god or something. Izuku just looks between the 2 of them as they talk, almost like they'd forgotten he was there. Banter. His 2 teachers, Aizawa-sensei and Present Mike, were bantering. He blinks, glancing towards Obero, and is doing the same thing, but almost as if the ghost can sense his gaze, he looks towards him. They're always like this. The ghost lifts one shoulder into a shrug. You'll get used to it. I've been telling you for ages that Sho's a softie. I mean, look at him holding that absolute demon of a cat. Adorable. The kettle whistles as Izuku looks back towards his teacher. The man leans down slightly, but the cat almost slinks out of his arms, landing on the floor with a thump. The cat saunters out of the room, and Izuku can't help but watch him go. He wishes he had that kind of confidence. Movement out of the corner of his eye draws his attention back to the table, where he sees his sensei setting a mug of steeping hot tea in front of him, before returning to the counter and pouring himself a mug of coffee. He chugs it, and geez, that's steaming hot. How? Before pouring a second, and then he sips as he joins them at the table. Present Mike had already set to work placing a plate in front of each of them, giving Izuku a small, comforting smile as he does so. He's so far out of his depth here, he doesn't even move until after his teachers have. Aizawa-sensei is the first to grab one of the rice balls, and Present Mike takes the next, clearly following his lead. Izuku hesitates, glancing between the 2 of them. Mike-sensei is already taking a bite out of his, but Aizawa-sensei is watching him lazily, silently urging him to do the same with his eyes. Izuku doesn't bite the bullet as fast as he wanted to, but eventually he does, and he grabs one of the onigiri from the plate in the center of the table, staring down at it before taking a tiny bite. It tastes good, and he's not exactly sure if it tastes amazing. He's sure it does, or if he's just so hungry that eating a shoe would probably have the same effect right now. After the first, he takes a bigger bite, suddenly aware of his hungry clench that his stomach had been in. He had been eating convenience store foods, lunch rushes, school meals, but he's painfully aware right now that his appetite hadn't been nagging him recently. He doesn't remember the last thing he actually ate, even though he had bought lunch from the cafeteria that day. He'd slept through lunch. He takes another bite, savoring the filling of the rice ball. It's a quick tuna filling, the same that you'd get from a convenience store, but it's so much better. Homemade. It's been a while since he's had anything homemade. It always tastes better. He savors the flavors as the painful, hungry feeling fades away to a calm contentment. His onigiri is gone before he realizes it. His teachers are still eating theirs, and he's reminded then of where he is. He feels nervous again, unsure if he should reach for another or not. Just take another one, Obero prompts from where he hadn't moved from the counter. Izuku's eyes flick towards him, but he doesn't move his head at all. Obero looks content where he's curled into a ball, his back pressed against the fridge, knees drawn up to his chest. It's a small, probably unused corner of the countertop between the fridge and the wall. That's probably been his spot for a long time. They won't care, the ghost adds. Trust me. He does trust the ghost, but he's still nervous. How could he not be? This was uncharted territory. He was in his teacher's, no, 2 of his teachers' home. Eat, problem child. Izuku jolts his gaze to where his sensei is finally reaching for another. Present Mike is gone now, too, but he's instead focused on his tea. I know you're hungry, so eat. If you don't eat them, they'll just go to waste. Well, Present Mike clears his throat. They'll go in the fridge for later, but yeah, eat as many as you like, little listener. Help yourself. Obero hums from where he's sitting, and Izuku knows if he were to glance over, the ghost would have a shit-eating grin on his face. With a slow, anxiously shaking hand, he reaches for another. He takes a bite just so he won't be expected to talk. Do you like them, listener? Present Mike asks over the rim of his mug. His eyes are bright despite the hour of the morning. Tone a pleasant calm that almost is like his regular teaching voice, but also completely not. Izuku nods hurriedly, mouth full of rice, dried seaweed, and tuna. He swallows the bite, looking towards them. "They're delicious," he promises, glancing between them both. "Thank you." Sensei waves him off as he takes another bite, and Present Mike smiles at him warmly. Not a lot is said after that. His teachers seem content to just let him eat for now. He finishes off the second, before grabbing a third, shooting a look between his teachers, but neither of them are paying attention to him. He takes a bite, glancing at Obero. The ghost, unlike his teachers, is watching him, but Izuku is pretty used to that. He looks back at the food before he's caught staring at a random corner at the teacher's kitchen. He finishes off the third, knows that he could eat a fourth, but he reaches for his tea instead. 4 seems rude. Mike Sensei had told him to help himself, but 4? Too much. He doesn't want to take advantage of their kindness and eat all their food, so instead he sips at the now lukewarm tea. It's sweet, almost perfectly so. It's calm in the kitchen. Still, he can't help but think about how it's a little weird being with his teachers outside of school. But it's less so now that he's warm and fed. It's the most content that he's felt in ages. He feels safe, even if he doesn't trust this completely. "You done, kid?" Aizawa-sensei asks casually, when Izuku makes no move to grab another. Head lolling to the side, he's clutching at the handle of his mug, looking down, ready to get a third cup. Izuku nods slowly. "Good, we'll talk now, then." Oof, maybe he's not as content as he thought. The admission has a strike of fear climbing along his spine. He'd almost forgotten about that part. He should have known that Sensei wasn't going to let this go. He had found him asleep on the ground, after all. He must look nervous because his Sensei regards him carefully, and Present Mike frowns thoughtfully. The blonde-haired teacher grabs the plate remaining onigiri before collecting all 3 plates as well. He makes himself busy at the counter. "Would you prefer to just talk to me?" Aizawa-sensei suggests quietly. Soft and inviting. He'd heard the tone before, but it was a rarity. Izuku shakes his head. He doesn't mind Present Mike knowing, and he's very aware that Obero wouldn't leave unless he's straight up told to. "Mike doesn't mind leaving, Midoriya, if that'll make you more comfortable." No, the teen shakes his head again. "I don't mind, just I don't know where to start." He's hardly aware that he's fidgeting with his mug, tracing the lines of the black cat on the side of it. He wants to be surprised by the cat mug, but after seeing his teacher with the cat from earlier, he'd be surprised if he was holding a black mug. Instead, something blank without one. "I could ask questions," Aizawa-sensei suggests, as Present Mike grabs his mug to refill. The man shoots his husband a fleeting grateful glance before returning his attention to Izuku. "You don't have to answer them, obviously. I can't, and I won't force you to. I want to understand, problem child." The teen gives a tiny, slow nod. That sounds reasonable. At least this way he doesn't have to retell everything. Sensei will give him a starting base, and he'll just fill in the blanks. The teen wonders where his teacher will start. "Well," the man's steady gaze is on Izuku. "First, I'd like to know where your mother is." The surprise must show on his face because the teacher regards him carefully. He'd not been expecting that. That's oddly specific to the current problem, but how would Sensei guess that so fast? The man's lips curl downward thoughtfully. "I'm going to take that as a no." "Why?" Izuku stops, clears his throat in a vain attempt to get his voice to stop being a nervous whisper. "Why are you wondering about my mother?" "We've been trying to get a hold of her," Aizawa-sensei explains, before his head cocks towards Izuku in disbelief. "Midoriya," his voice comes out breathy, "you can't honestly think that we wouldn't be trying to figure out why you've been so different in class. We've been worried about you. You've been more tired, less focused. Your grades have been starting to slip. We've been trying to arrange a wellness check with you and your mother for over a week." You have?" "We have," the man assures him. "Mike and I stopped by your apartment on Saturday since none of our calls were returned, but no one was home. I was going to ask you to have your mother get in contact with me after your training on Sunday, but it slipped my mind since we ended early. And I'd planned to keep you after class today, or yesterday now, I suppose, but well." Izuku silently thanks his teacher for his trailing off instead of reminding him of how he'd run from the gym without a word. Not his proudest moment. Present Mike returns a pot of tea in one hand and Aizawa-sensei's mug of coffee in the other. He sets the mug in front of the man before silently offering Izuku more tea. He accepts just so he'll have something to keep his mind distracted with. Izuku's still curious how much Aizawa-sensei had heard, but he's not curious enough to bring it up and ask. If he did that, he might have to actually talk about it, and he didn't exactly have excuse for why he was yelling at someone who wasn't really there. "So you haven't seen your mother, listener?" Present Mike asked softly, head angled in Izuku's direction. "Oh, no, she works a lot, and we, had opposite schedules, so she wasn't usually around. I didn't actually see her, but I knew she was there, you know." "When was the last time you saw her?" Aizawa-sensei cocks an eyebrow at him. Izuku drops his gaze to the mug in his hands as he swallows. His fingers fiddle with the ceramic running along the handle. She signed my UA admission forms for me, but I hadn't really seen her." He hears Present Mike suck in a breath, and he can feel Aizawa-sensei stiffen, even with the space between them. He knows this looks bad. He knows. He's known it wasn't normal or right, but that's just how it was. "Midoriya," Aizawa-sensei says slowly, unsettled. "That was almost a month ago." I know, Sensei." Izuku feels stupid admitting that they were so dysfunctional. He hadn't seen his mother in a month. She'd moved out without him realizing, and he'd been thinking that it was all just normal. He hadn't realized that she'd left because she was never around to begin with, because it wasn't a concern when he didn't see her for a few days or a week or hell, even a few weeks. There's a silence that settles in around them. He wouldn't exactly call it suffocating, but it wasn't comforting either. It was almost tense, but in that disbelieving kind of way. They were shocked. He could see it in the way that neither knew what to say next, but their faces and tense shoulders showed him that. "How have you been?" "She took care of me," Izuku admitted without looking up, finger smoothing along the rim of his mug, something to do. "She gave me allowance money for food and kept the apartment rent paid, so I had a roof over my head. I never went without. I had clothes and stuff and everything I needed. Sometimes she'd come home, but I never really saw her." "Izuku." Sensei's voice is soft, and Izuku forces his gaze up because Aizawa-sensei had never sounded like that, nor has he ever used any of their first names. "You were sleeping on the street behind a dumpster. That isn't being taken care of." Present Mike lets out a noise somewhere between a gasp and a choke, but Aizawa-sensei doesn't draw his attention away from Izuku. The teen might have laughed at the fact that Aizawa-sensei clearly hadn't explained anything to his husband, if he weren't so close to crying. "Izuku." Oboro's voice sounds raw off to the side, and that's where the teen realized that he wasn't close to crying, he was crying. He wipes at his eyes, clearing his throat. "A week and a half ago," he blows out a stuttered breath, "our landlord came to the door to talk to my mom. She wasn't there, but I thought she was just, at work or busy, like she usually was." He sees his teachers exchange a look out of the corner of his eye, but he's busy trying to do anything he can to not start starving at the whole table in front of them. "He told me that she hadn't paid rent prior in the week, and, well, it was due, so he asked me to pass on the message to her." Izuku's quiet for a second as he tries to figure out how to carry on with this. How do you tell your teachers that your mother left you, just packed up without you knowing, and just took off to God knows where? The boy shakes his head when his voice comes out in a whisper, continuing when he's sure he'll have volume again. "I went to her room because I thought, it's been a while since I've seen her. He sucks in a breath, squeezing his eyes shut. Her stuff was all gone. She was gone." "Gone?" Present Mike breathed out like he was missing something, maybe even hoping that he was missing something, but he had it all right. "Did she?" Aizawa-sensei starts before pausing, clearly thinking his words through completely. "Did she leave anything for you? An explanation for her absence, or have you not heard anything from her at all?" Izuku gives a slow nod, fingers tightening around the mug. He releases his grip, silently afraid that he'll accidentally activate One for All and smash his sensei's mug. He reaches down to his backpack, unzipping it before pulling out his hero analysis notebook, the one that held his mother's parting note pressed between the pages. His fingers tapped on the book's cover, silently trying to decide whether he really wanted to show them. He'd already come this far, might as well. He flipped the cover open, thumb tracing along the edge of the note before he picked it up and handed it to his homeroom teacher, without a word. For a second, Aizawa-sensei just holds the note exactly where Izuku had given it to him. His hand hovers over the table, the little sheet of folded paper pressed between his fingertips. The man glares down at it, holding it in front of him like the note will spring to life and bite him. Izuku's sure that he'd stared at it exactly the same way at some point, but now looking at it just made him feel numb. He holds in a bated breath until finally his teacher lifts his other hand to unfold it. The man's breath hitches as his shoulders square up. He glares down at it like he's reading those 2 words on repeat over and over again. Finally, he sets it down on the table like he can't bear to look at it any longer, and slides it towards the other teacher without a word. He'd spared Izuku a glance as if he was almost asking for permission to share it, but Izuku had refused to meet his eyes, merely lifting one of his shoulders in a pathetic shrug. Present Mike's face holds a lot more emotion than Aizawa-sensei's when he reads it, sad eyes bouncing between the 2 words, before he's looking at Izuku with a soft, sympathetic look. "Oh, kiddo." The teen gives another shrug. He brings his hand back up to the mug. The tea in his hand has gone pretty cold now, but he still takes a tentative sip. His cheeks feel kind of wet, so he rubs his against them and up against his shoulder in an attempt to try and dry them up. "Izuku." Aizawa-sensei's voice is calm and cautious as he addresses the teen. "How long have you been sleeping on the street?" He doesn't really want to answer, but he can't just not answer, so when his 2 teachers are giving him such soft, understanding looks, he wants to believe that they understand him. He doesn't want to do this alone anymore. Technically 3 nights. I got the eviction notice 3 days ago, but I was scared to sleep on the first night for the streets, so I slept in the 24-hour laundromat that's in my neighborhood. They caught on and I wasn't allowed to sleep there again, so he stares down into his tea. Just the 2 nights on the street. Izuku squeezes his eyes shut and only opens them when he feels a hand on his forearm. The touch is oddly comforting. Present Mike has always been the teacher that would pat their heads and their shoulders when they'd done well in class, or set cautious touches on their shoulders or arms when they needed some comfort. He did it to everyone in Class 1A, and Izuku was sure it didn't stop with them. "I'm sorry you went through that, Izuku," Present Mike tells him, and for some reason Izuku actually believes him. Some people say it just because it's the right thing to say, but Izuku's sure that's not the case here. "Why didn't you tell me, Izuku?" Izuku looks up at his homeroom teacher. The man is frowning, but it's a different than his usual frown. It's almost deeper, holding emotions that Izuku can't really place, but it makes him feel guilty, like Aizawa-sensei honestly cares about his well-being, and maybe he does. Izuku doesn't know. He's never really had teachers, like Aizawa-sensei and Mike-sensei who cared before. So he shrugs. I could have helped you, kid. I would have helped you." "I didn't want to be a burden," the teen whispers. He feels Present Mike's hand squeeze his forearm in an attempt to comfort or reassure him, but it doesn't really work. "You're already so busy, and you were kind enough to take extra time to help me with my quirk. I didn't want to be a bother to anyone. I thought I could do it all myself." "You're not a bother, problem child." Izuku feels a slight smile slip onto his face, speaking without really looking up. "You can't really tell me I'm not a bother and then call me problem child, Sensei. It kind of contradicts itself." Present Mike lets out a snort of laughter, but Aizawa-sensei just scans the teenager before his lips quirk up in the faintest amount. "I suppose I can't argue with that logic. You are a problem child, but you're no way a bother. I expect you kids to cause problems. You're all learning. But even with all those problems, and I'm expecting a lot with your classmates, none of you are burdens or bothers." There's a pause, but it's no longer than a second before Sensei continues, voice sharp with resolve, but still quiet and attentive. "It's okay to need help sometimes, kid." He sees Present Mike nodding in agreement out of the corner of his eye. He notices the blonde-haired man's hand is gone. He's not sure when he pulled back, His arms are now crossed on the table in front of him, almost holding himself up. Izuku frowns down at his tea, thumbing the side of his mug. I need help, Sensei. Saying it both knocks the wind out of him and lifts a weight off of his shoulders. The mix of hopefulness and dread swirl in his stomach almost unpleasantly. He's not sure which he should be feeling after admitting that he needed help, ultimately asking his teachers. He's not sure is even the right way to be feeling right now. I've got you, Midoriya, his sensei replies, and Izuku feels his teacher's foot nudge against his under the table. That action, for some insane reason, has Izuku's shoulders easing up a little from the strain of anxiety he'd had tensing in his muscle for as long as he could remember. You're not in this alone anymore. We're right there with you, listener, President Mike adds with a wide, toothy grin. The blonde pats Izuku's hand comfortingly, smile softening to something a little more personal. Definitely right there with you. Obero joins in, his own voice just as hushed. Izuku wants to look over at him, but knows better than to do so, especially when his observant sensei is already watching him. 100%, Zuku. You're stuck with me. He can't not smile at that, though. Izuku takes a sip of his tea, looking between his teachers thoughtfully. What happens now? You go to sleep, Aizawa-sensei huffs, standing from his chair, his back cracks as he stretches lightly. I highly doubt you've been getting much sleep on the streets, so you're going to actually sleep here, in the guest room, in an actual bed. Izuku opens his mouth to respond, but instead lets out a quiet yawn. He really is tired. He hadn't realized how tired he actually was. He wipes at his eyes with the balls of his palms, stifling a second yawn as he does so. You must be beat, little listener, President Mike coos, but it's not condescending at all. It's gentle and comforting in a distantly familiar kind of way. The blonde-haired man stands slowly, leaving his mug on the table as he pushes his chair under it. Come on, I'll show you to the guest room, and you go ahead and grab your bag, kiddo. Izuku does as he's told, too tired to put up a fight. Now that his teacher had mentioned a bed, it's all he can really think about. He's so tired, exhausted. He just wants to sleep, and now he can. He wavers when he finally pushes himself to his feet. Aizawa-sensei steadies himself, and Izuku with a hand on his upper arm, only pulling away when the wobbling has stopped. There's an almost humorous tilt to his teacher's lips. Have a good rest, problem child, the man teases, but Izuku can hear the sincerity in it. And then the man's hand is on his head, fingers ruffling through his still slightly damp curls, and Izuku just knows that he leans into the touch, due to his exhaustion. Obero is giggling, and Izuku is sure that he hears Sensei let out a soft puff of laughter as well. Still, he can't fight it in himself to be upset. He just feels so soft and warm, so not alone. He likes it. Come on, kiddo, President Mike calls again, this time from the doorway. Let's get you to bed before you fall over. At last he's tucked away in a bed, wrapped under warm, soft blankets, and with his head buried in a pillow. Izuku feels at ease. He hardly even cares that he's in his teacher's guest room, in his teacher's apartment. All he cares about is sleep. This concludes Chapter 11 of Yuuei Survival Guide. I'll be back with Chapter 12 for you guys here soon, but this was one of my favorite chapters. It's just such a good one. Hope you guys enjoyed as well, and as always, thank you so much for listening.